Imagine owning a peaceful lakefront cabin passed down through generations only to have a power-hungry HOA queen try to claim it as her own and call 911 on you in broad daylight. This isn't just a petty neighbor squabble. This is a full-blown war over land rights, legacy, and entitlement, with one epic downfall you won't see coming. Before we dive into this cinematic showdown, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a story where justice hits harder than HOA fines on trash day. Now let me take you to the day it all unraveled, starting with a scream echoing across the lake. The red and blue lights flashed like a warning from the universe through the wooden blinds of my cabin, and I sat up in bed, heart hammering against my ribs. There was shouting outside, a voice yelling for me to come out with my hands where they could see them. I stumbled to my feet, the scent of pine smoke still clinging to my clothes from the fire pit last night, and I cracked the door open to see two officers standing on the gravel path, one with a hand on his holster. They looked ready for anything. I stepped outside barefoot on cold planks, chest rising and falling like a bellows, and said in a calm voice that betrayed none of the rising panic inside me, "Can I help you, officers?" They said they received a 911 call reporting a break-in at this address, possibly involving narcotics. I blinked confused, then laughed once, short and bitter. "This is my cabin," I said. "I live here." One officer glanced at the other and asked for ID, and I handed over my wallet, explaining that I had inherited the place from my grandfather just a few months ago and had been staying here ever since. They asked to look around, and I stepped aside, letting them in, the scent of cedar filling the small open room as they moved through it. The younger one nodded slowly, clearly realizing the mistake, while the other tapped something into a tablet. I stood on the porch, arms crossed against the early morning chill, and my eyes were drawn across the lake to the property next door. She was watching from her deck, wine glass in hand, robe billowing like a villain in a stage play. Kerren. I had met her the first day I arrived, and she made it clear that she was the president of the HOA and that this lake was governed by rules and order, and that I looked like I didn't understand either. The thing was, my property wasn't part of her HOA, not technically, not legally, and I had the paperwork to prove it. Still, she had hounded me from the start. At first it was little things, passive-aggressive comments, notes on my windshield when I parked too close to the shrubs. Then it escalated. She claimed my cabin violated zoning codes, accused me of drawing power illegally, and even had someone from the county inspect my new dock. Nothing stuck. Until now. Now she had gone nuclear. Calling the cops. I was shaking, not just from the cold but from the violation of it all. This place was supposed to be peace. After my divorce, I needed something that didn't scream loss and failure. This cabin had been untouched for years, overgrown and forgotten, and I poured myself into fixing it up, restoring every nail and floorboard with my own hands. And she wanted to take that from me because she didn't like the view from her side of the lake. The officers finished their sweep and apologized, said there was nothing suspicious and that sometimes neighbors called in things they shouldn't. I nodded silently, and they left, their cruiser's tires crunching the gravel as they drove away. From her deck, Kerren lifted her glass and smiled. The kind of smile that makes your skin crawl. Like she had just tested the waters and found them warm enough for war. I went back inside and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floorboards I had sanded for days until my hands blistered. She had crossed a line. There's a difference between annoying and dangerous. Between controlling and vindictive. Calling 911 with a false report that could have ended with me in cuffs or worse was beyond petty. It was criminal. And she didn't even flinch. She thought she could get away with it. Thought I would pack up and leave and she could claim my little strip of heaven as hers. I looked at the photo on the mantel, me and Grandpa in front of the cabin 20 years ago, fishing rods in hand, his arm around my shoulder. He always said the lake was ours in spirit and in truth. I never understood what he meant until that moment. Until she tried to take it from me. My anger cooled, slowly solidifying into something sharper, more deliberate. Not rage but resolve. If she wanted to play games, she was going to find out real quick. I wasn't some city guy she could scare off with HOA letters and fake police reports. I wasn't leaving. And I wasn't afraid of her. I stood up slowly, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out the thick folder that held every deed, survey, and historical record of the property going back 80 years. The papers crackled in my hands as I opened it. A map unfolded, and with it a memory. Grandpa's voice echoing in my head. "You protect this shoreline, son." I looked out the window at the lake, still and silent, the moon reflecting off it like a sheet of glass. This was my home. And she had just made her first mistake. The next move was mine. She showed up the next morning in full war regalia, tennis visor, clipboard, and a smugness so thick it practically shimmered in the sun. I was trimming a hedge that didn't need trimming when she marched up the gravel path without so much as a knock or greeting. "You're in violation of Article 12, she said in a tone like a substitute teacher catching a kid chewing gum. I didn't bother asking what Article 12 was because, again, I wasn't part of her HOA and she knew that. "I'm not under your jurisdiction," I said without looking up. She clicked her pen twice and scribbled something. "This isn't about you being under or over anything," she said. "This is about neighborhood integrity and standards and shared community values." She handed me a bright orange notice printed in bold capital letters and signed in a flourish like she was the sheriff of some dusty lakeside town. I glanced at it and laughed. It meant nothing. But the problem was she acted like it did. Later that week I found plastic signs hammered into the ground along the lake's edge. HOA common property, they read in all caps. She'd gone from passive to possessive. Neighbors started acting strange too. One guy who used to wave stopped making eye contact. A couple with a pontoon boat pulled it out of the water early, and I heard through a local that Kerren had warned them the shoreline was under review for misuse. I tried being civil. Tried explaining to her like a rational adult that the cabin sat on land excluded from the HOA by historical deed. I even offered to meet with her and the board to show the documents and lay everything out. She smirked through my entire speech, then leaned in and said, "Let me make this clear. This cabin is a blot on our lakeside image, and I have no intention of letting it stay." She turned and walked off like the queen of a kingdom that didn't exist. It wasn't just the arrogance. It was the way she made me feel like I didn't belong in my own skin on my own land. Then came the letter from the county. It said my dock was under investigation for potential violations of shoreline regulations. I knew who filed it. There were only 2 docks on this inlet, and hers was bigger, louder, and stretched farther into the water than mine. I called the office and requested copies of the complaint. They arrived days later, and I wasn't surprised to see her name in bold ink. She accused me of altering the wetland structure with an illegal platform and claimed my construction threatened native species. The irony was stunning considering her party lights stayed on all night and her motorboat leaked oil into the water like a mechanical hemorrhage. But that was her move. Bury me in paper until I gave up. I was getting buried all right. But not under paper. Under rage. The kind that doesn't explode. The kind that sharpens. So I started digging. Not metaphorically. I dug into the records. I spent 3 days at the local clerk's office reviewing deeds, surveys, HOA boundaries, and shoreline rights. Then I found it. An old document buried in a collection of scanned microfiche. A shoreline easement signed in my grandfather's name dated back decades, granting exclusive riparian rights to the land surrounding the cabin. Not just my dock. The entire shoreline wrapping around the inlet. My family owned it. Kerren's lake access ran right across it. Technically, every dock, boat, and deck along this side of the lake was encroaching on our easement. I sat in my truck gripping the steering wheel as the weight of it settled in. She thought she was playing a game. But she was playing it on my board. The next morning I walked along the shore, camera in hand, taking photos. Her deck. Her dock. Her sprinkler system pumping water straight from the lake. All of it. Over the line. And just when I thought I had reached peak absurdity, I found a cable running underwater connecting her property to a floating raft in the middle of the cove. Her floating sunbathing island. Anchored right into our water rights. I wasn't angry anymore. I was cold. Clear. I went back and gathered everything. The photos. The documents. The survey maps with the lines clearly marked. I set up a trail camera near the shore hidden in a tree and pointed at the cove. That same day she posted in the neighborhood forum a photo of my cabin captioned, "We'll have this cleaned up by fall, don't worry friends." The audacity. She spoke like she already owned it, like my home was some community weed she was planning to pull. But I wasn't the weed. I was the soil. And she didn't realize how deep the roots ran. I printed her post. Added it to the folder. Kerren wasn't just overstepping. She was trespassing. Repeatedly and publicly. I just had to wait. I just had to let her keep digging her own deck deeper into the dirt. Let her build confidence until it became overconfidence. And then I would make my move. But not with threats or fake notices or orange flyers. With facts. With law. With the one thing she couldn't manipulate. Ownership. I stood by the water that evening watching the sun set across a lake she thought was hers. She didn't know yet. But her reign was ending. And I was about to write the last chapter myself. The email was short. To the County Enforcement Office. Subject line. Formal notice of encroachment and easement violation. I attached every document, photo, and survey map with precise annotations and filed a certified complaint. No flair. No emotion. Just the raw truth. 3 days later I got a reply. A field officer had been assigned. They would be conducting an on-site inspection within the week. The gears of bureaucracy had started turning. And Kerren had no idea they were about to grind her entire lakeside fantasy into dust. I didn't stop there. I sent a duplicate package to the HOA legal department requesting a formal meeting to address boundary violations and shared liability risks related to unauthorized structures. It wasn't just her dock anymore. It was the entire board that would now have to answer for ignoring documented land rights and contributing to prolonged trespassing. I stayed quiet. Let her host her lakeside brunches and strut around in her wide-brimmed hat barking orders at the neighbors like some kind of HOA warlord. She thought silence meant surrender. But all it meant was strategy. The inspection came on a Tuesday. Unmarked SUV. 2 officials in khaki vests and clipboards. I greeted them at the edge of my driveway and handed them the original deed and shoreline easement again just in case. They thanked me and said they would conduct their survey independently, then reach out with formal findings. I watched them walk toward her deck where she stood waiting, already complaining loudly about how she had warned them of my presence and hoped they were there to resolve the situation before it got out of hand. I saw one of them raise an eyebrow. Then they asked for her documents. She waved toward her house and said, "Oh, I don't keep those things here, darling." I went back inside and made coffee. Stared out the window as they measured from the waterline to the artificial edge of her deck. Watched as they took photos of the floating raft and the cable anchoring it to the lake bed. Later that night I received an email. Preliminary findings confirmed multiple encroachments including unpermitted shoreline modification and violation of an existing private easement. They would be issuing notices. But before that could happen, Kerren made her next move. She showed up at my door again, this time with a man in a suit who introduced himself as HOA legal counsel. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Told me the board had decided that my presence created undue tension and they were prepared to make a generous offer to purchase the cabin. I almost laughed but held it in. "Let me guess," I said. "You'll clean it up for the good of the community?" He chuckled and said, "It's just business." I asked how much they were offering. He gave me a number. It was insulting. Barely a third of what I'd put into restoring the place. I told them the land wasn't for sale. Not now. Not ever. Kerren didn't speak the whole time, just stood behind him, arms crossed like a statue carved out of entitlement. Before they left I handed him a folder. Inside were printed copies of the official inspection report and a notarized letter stating my intent to pursue legal remedy if any further trespassing occurred. The man in the suit paled slightly and said, "I see." Kerren's smile cracked for the first time. Then came the fallout. One by one the neighbors started receiving notices. Not just from the county but from their insurance providers. Kerren's floating dock was deemed a violation and she was ordered to remove it within 30 days or face daily fines. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. I was invited. Not as a guest, but as the owner of the land they had been building on for years. The conference room was tense. Kerren sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled, lips pressed into a single bitter line. I laid out the entire history. Pointed to the maps. Read aloud from the easement. Then I passed around photos of every structure that crossed the boundary. No one spoke for a while. Then one board member said, "Are you saying we owe you back rent?" I looked him in the eye and said, "I'm saying you owe me respect. And I'm offering a path forward before lawyers start getting expensive." Kerren tried to interrupt, but the others were already flipping through the pages. The weight of what I held finally sank in. The power she thought she had was gone. Taken not by force, but by fact. After the meeting 2 neighbors approached me in the parking lot. They apologized. Said they had no idea she was pushing so hard to get me out. Said they felt manipulated. I shook their hands and told them all I ever wanted was peace. And I meant it. But peace didn't come free. It came after war. And the last battle hadn't even started yet. Because Kerren, even with everything collapsing, still had one more play. And I was ready for it. It started with sirens. Blue and red lights bounced across the lake like an emergency sunrise, and I stepped out onto my porch with a mug of coffee in hand just as 2 squad cars rolled up the gravel drive. A third one idled near the lake edge, tires crunching the grass. One officer approached and called out, "Are you the owner of this property?" I nodded. "Mind if we talk, sir?" I motioned him up and watched as Kerren emerged from behind the tree line, hair wind-blown, expression triumphant like she had just orchestrated a victory parade. She pointed toward my dock, shouting, "That's him, that's the one who trespassed, built illegal structures, harassed the community. He's dangerous. I want him removed right now." I blinked slowly. Looked at the officer who shifted uncomfortably and said, "Sir, she called saying you were attempting to claim HOA land by force and threatening residents." I reached behind the screen door and handed him a folder. Inside was the county ruling, dated and sealed, the confirmed easement, the official letters from their department, and the HOA correspondence. He flipped through it. His brow furrowed. Another officer approached, looked over his shoulder, then turned toward Kerren. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to calm down and step back, please." Kerren's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She stared at the officers, then at me, then back at the lake, as if waiting for reality to rearrange itself in her favor. "Do you understand what's happening here?" she said, voice cracking. "This man is stealing from the entire community. He's a fraud." The officer replied. "Ma'am, everything he's presented checks out. This shoreline is privately owned and the county has already ruled on it." Then her mask shattered. In front of 3 officers and the neighbor who had wandered down with a phone recording, she lost it completely. "You think this is over? I built this neighborhood. I brought order to this place. He doesn't belong here. He never did." I didn't speak. Didn't move. Just watched her rant spiral into chaos, her words unraveling like frayed rope pulled too tight for too long. Another officer gently placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Ma'am, you're trespassing right now. We're going to have to ask you to leave immediately." She screamed. A wild, inhuman sound that echoed across the water and sent birds flying from the trees. Then, silence. Not just quiet, but that stunned kind of silence that only comes when an entire illusion collapses at once. They escorted her back to her property. No handcuffs. Not yet. But with enough shame trailing behind her to weigh down a boat. Later that day, her floating dock was dismantled by a hired crew under county supervision. Her sprinkler system disconnected. Her garden lights pulled. Everything she had built to extend her reach across land that was never hers disappeared piece by piece. I didn't cheer. Didn't smile. Just watched from my porch as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across a shoreline that finally felt like mine again. Then the video surfaced. A neighbor had posted the meltdown on social media. The caption read, "When HOA Kerren calls 911 on the lakefront owner and regrets everything." It went viral overnight. 500,000 views in 2 days. The comments ranged from disbelief to pure vindication. Some quoted her line, "He doesn't belong here." Others tagged their own HOAs saying, "Looks familiar." Kerren vanished after that. No more walks. No more brunches. Her house went up for sale within the month. Whispers said the HOA asked her to step down quietly. A polite exile. Wrapped in fake smiles and signatures. But I knew. And the neighbors knew. She didn't just lose her dock or her status. She lost the image she built brick by brick. I spent the next weekend clearing brush along the shore. 2 kids from down the road came by, asked if they could fish off my dock again. I told them, "Anytime, just treat the lake like it's yours too." The boy looked at me and said, "It's better without her yelling all the time." I laughed, tossed them a bag of worms and watched them cast lines into the still water. That night, as the sky turned purple and stars blinked over the lake, I sat by the fire pit and finally breathed. The war was over. Not because I crushed her, but because I outlasted her. Because I used truth where she used power. Because roots run deeper than noise. She thought I was just a stubborn man in a rundown cabin. But she forgot something vital. You can't evict history. You can't erase legacy. And you definitely can't take what was never yours to begin with. As the fire cracked and the lake whispered against the shore, I raised a glass and whispered, "To the queen who lost her crown, may she find peace far from my shoreline."